So, the second part of chapter 6, we move from focusing on deviance to introducing the criminal justice system. And that is because if you want to think about how these two things are related, that before, when we were talking about formal social control and formal norms, laws are a form of a formal norm, and they are used as a form of formal social control. So this is from the last presentation, but just some things to keep in mind. Laws were created in response to a perceived need for formal social control. So in order for us to exert formal social control and not informal social control, the norm needs to be formalized into a law or a policy or regulation so that the consequences of breaking that law or policy can also be formalized. That being said, laws themselves just reflect kind of our continually changing standards of what is right and wrong. So this isn't necessarily something stable. So just because something is legal or illegal does not mean that it necessarily has always been legal or illegal or will always be legal or illegal. And so who gets to decide, this kind of changing standard of rightness, wrongness, criminality, like most of the formal norms or norms in general, it reflects the values of those who are in positions of authority and power. So this is kind of dominant society's perception of this is the type of behavior that we need to formally regulate. And so a crime is just any type of behavior that violates criminal law. So it's a specific form of deviance because obviously deviance is behavior that violates a norm, but crime is behavior that violates a specific type of norm, a criminal law, whether it's on the local, state, or federal level. And when I say the word crime, several different types of crimes might pop into your head. But when we actually measure crime or we think about crime, we focus on the fact that there are kind of five major categories of crime. And we're going to talk about what each of those categories are, beginning with violent crime. So violent crime is anything that involves force or the threat of force against others. And this includes things like murder, rape, gang violence, aggravated assault, and robbery. And these types of crimes might have been what came to your mind when I asked you, what do you think about when you think about crime? And that's because violent crime is oftentimes what we read about or what we see on news stories, which leads us to sometimes think that the world that we live in is a lot more violent than what it really is. In reality, violent crime has been reduced in a lot of areas, but this does vary by state. So what you see here is a map of the country that depicts which are the safest and which are the most dangerous states. So safest states, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Virginia, Wyoming. So when you think about what those states have in common, some of them are states which are fairly sparsely populated, like so that would be like Maine or Wyoming. And then some of them are states that are largely affluent and well off. And we know that there's a correlation between violent crime and poverty. So that probably explains the lower violent crime rates in places like Vermont and New Hampshire. When you look at states that are the most dangerous in terms of violent crime, those are the kind of teal states. You'll see that, we have some of those states here in the South, but then we also have a lot of those states in the Southwest, in the western part of the country. And so the most dangerous states are Nevada and Alaska, and then Tennessee, surprisingly, at number two, and then New Mexico. And specifically, Nevada with Vegas is maybe not very surprising that it's a violent state, but sometimes students are very surprised that Alaska is on that list. And I will say that a lot of what generates the violent crime rate in Alaska is violence against women in the form of sexual assault as well as domestic violence. Alaska has some of the highest violence against women crime rates in the country, and that is largely what is a contributing factor to their first place spot. But if violent crime isn't all that common, what are the more common forms of crime? Well, we have, property crime. This is the taking of money or property from another without force, threat of force, or the destruction of property. So this would be examples of things like burglary, shoplifting, identity theft, arson, which of course is intentionally, burning property. So that's property crime. And then we have this is either I have it here as if it's one category, but it's not. It's two categories, occupational and corporate. So in both cases, it's illegal activities committed by people in the course of their employment or normal business activity. And these are the types of crimes that we refer to as white collar crimes. So things like fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, bribery. What is the distinction between occupational and corporate? Well, occupational crime is you, the individual, are engaging in this activity without your company's knowledge, awareness, or them, sanctioning you, encouraging you to engage in that type of behavior. It's considered corporate crime if the whole business is engaged in this type of in this type of activity, right? So, occupational crime is one criminal employee in a company, and a corporate crime is if the entire company is more or less engaging in this criminal act. And then we have organized crime, which, whether you're thinking about it in terms of the mob, the mafia, or just even your regular street gangs, that would be what we mean. These are business operations that supply illegal goods and services, or sometimes legal goods and services, but they're supplying it illegally for profit. So this is how gangs, mobs, mafias, this is how they make money, right? So they might engage in violent activity, but the process by which they are making a profit is what we call organized crime. And then the final category is juvenile crime or juvenile delinquency, which can be any, well, certainly maybe not occupational and corporate, but it certainly can be any violent or property crime as well, except now the perpetrator is someone who is legally underage. And so this is basically criminal behavior that's engaged in by a young person. Now, there are some crimes that are only crimes because of the age of the person committing them, and we call them status offenses. So a status offense would be something like truancy, not attending school, right? That is a status offense. We certainly don't have an adult version of that for when you don't attend work. In that case, you might just lose your job, but no one's going to be locked up for that. But truancy, you possibly that can possibly result in an arrest. Underage drinking, underage smoking. If you live in an area where there's a curfew, violating curfew. All of those would be status offenses, things that are only crimes because of the age of the person that's committing them. So, a reminder, crime is a good example to kind of think about when you're thinking about that primary, secondary deviance. Because in the same way that people commit primary deviance and we are not necessarily aware of them engaging in those acts, we are not necessarily aware of all the criminal acts that go on. People commit crime, and if they're not caught, once again, it's like that tree falling in the woods. Who really knows? Our awareness of crime begins when you get caught or when a person gets caught. And so just know, as I move through the rest of this presentation and as I move through the second presentation on criminal justice, that our criminal statistics, almost all of them begin with this: you were in some way caught committing a crime. It was reported to the police. Someone called an authority figure on you. So we have a lot less systematic information about the crimes that happen that people don't get caught for. So I'm acknowledging that those things do exist, but it's kind of, in a sense, unknowable in a lot of ways. So, what happens when you do get caught? Well, I have two kind of graphs. I suggest you decide which one you like. Do you like the one with the pictures or do you like the flow chart? And whichever one you like, I would print out that entire slide so you can kind of like fully see it and get a sense of what's happening here. I myself, I prefer the one that's the flow chart. So, in that blue block is crime. The crime is happening. But the next block, reported and observed crime. That's important because if someone observes you committing it and they reporting it, then this begins your entryway into the criminal justice system, the sequence of events that make up the criminal justice system. Otherwise, just committing the crime, if it's not observed and it's not reported, isn't necessarily a foray into the criminal justice system. So in the same way that everyone who commits primary deviance isn't labeled and doesn't experience secondary deviance, similarly, everyone that commits a crime is not necessarily observed and it's not necessarily reported. But if it is reported, then it is your entryway into the criminal justice system, which is the network of organizations involved in law enforcement and the administration of justice. And there are kind of three kind of key institutions, figures that make up this system. The first being the police, the second being courts, and then the third kind of being the institutions and people involved with punishment and prisons. So first of all, let's begin with the police. So, if you are thinking about someone observed and reported you committing a crime, the next step is investigation, and that's where the police come in. But just because a crime is reported and police go out to investigate does not necessarily mean that the next step takes place, which is arrest. And this is where a lot of people who do not have experience in the criminal justice system, this is where they've kind of exited out of the system. And what I mean by that is, if you look where it says investigation, then the little pathway out of that says unsolved or not arrested. So we know that that is a path that the people who commit crime, who never find themselves any deeper in the criminal justice system, is because they weren't arrested. So being arrested is not necessarily as objective as one would think. Police do have some leeway. They do have some discretion when it comes to making decisions regarding arrest. And there are kind of four major factors that can influence whether or not a person is arrested. So the first factor, and this makes total sense, is the nature of the alleged offense. So obviously police have a lot more discretion with lower level crimes, jaywalking, speeding, littering even, than they do with a more severe offense like murder. For the most part, you can't just opt to not investigate a murder. In the same way you can opt to like not arrest someone for maybe like public drunkenness, right? So nature of offense is key. Second factor is quality of evidence. So sometimes there is not that because the crime is not significant, and things like, for instance, sexual assault. A lot of sexual assault is known for being the type of violent crime where the percentage of people that where it doesn't necessarily result in an arrest, has caught the attention of people who are victim advocates and activists. They see that as a point of concern, and this is because that this is a good example of one where the factor at play, a quality of available evidence. If there isn't strong evidence, you need to ask, why would the police necessarily decide to make an arrest if they don't think it's going to result in a successful case, or it going to trial, or being in a court? Or maybe it's just without good available evidence, they aren't necessarily certain if the crime has in fact been committed. With sexual assault, when oftentimes it can come down to just the victim's story and the perpetrator's story. If that's the only available evidence, oftentimes police will decide to not make an arrest in some of those cases. The third factor, age, race, and sex of alleged offender. We will talk about that more later on in this presentation, but there are just major disparities in terms of who is arrested, as well as, who is then found guilty and what type of sentences that they receive. And a lot of that seems to relate to age, race, and sex. If part of why we arrest people and lock people up is because we feel like that it is needed for societal protection, or we feel that they need to be rehabilitated, then our own kind of biases regarding people's age or people's race or people's sex can come into play as we see different people as being threatening, or less threatening. And then the final one, and this may not be news for anyone that's ever sweet talked themselves out of a ticket, is the level of deference shown to a police officer. Once again, this isn't going to matter so much if what we're talking about is a murder charge, but especially for lower level charges, then certainly people that go into their interactions with the police showing a higher level of deference, which is not required by law, but certainly can contribute to you perhaps not experiencing an arrest. And so all of this is just to say that police do have a wide discretion around their arrest decisions. And because arrest is the kind of first major foray into the criminal justice system for people that are big on the idea of criminal justice reform, they can find this discretion problematic. It makes it hard to really argue that even from the outset that everyone that commits a crime is treated the exact same way. And if they are not treated the exact same way at the outset, then everything that comes later, in regards to the courts and the punishment and the prison, comes into question. And certainly the kind of subjective and the kind of varied outcomes with the police has come under greater scrutiny in light of movements like Black Lives Matter, the adoption of body cams by more and more police departments, people's willingness to film police interactions on their own cell phones. So all of these types of questions, which is worth noting, sociologists who study the criminal justice system have been studying this for a lot longer than just the last couple of years, but certainly this has become of greater interest to people as of late. Then the next step in the criminal justice system is the courts. The courts are responsible for determining guilt or innocence of people accused of committing a crime. And although you don't need to know, how the system works, this isn't a criminal justice class. You can kind of see in the purple. In the purple part, that's the part related to courts, that there are several different steps: initial appearance, preliminary hearings, they set bail, that once again, at each step, there is the possibility that something will happen that will lead to a person basically exiting out of the system. And for sociologists, especially for sociologists that are from the conflict perspective, their big question is, of course, always about like the inequalities that exist, at that each level. And we'll come back to some examples of that in the next presentation. And then the final step of the criminal justice system is punishment in prisons. So the reason why we have a criminal justice system that results in punishment is that it's believed that punishment has four functions: retribution, social protection, rehabilitation, and deterrence. Retribution is basically just eye for an eye justice. You did something to society, so society is going to punish you. Social protection is you are dangerous, you are a danger to society, society needs to be protected from you, and that's why we are giving you this punishment. Rehabilitation. You currently are not a contributing, helpful member of society, but we believe that through this punishment, we can make you into being that type of person. And then finally, deterrence. By punishing you, we are sending a message to anyone else that would consider a similar crime, and discouraging them from committing that crime. And so, if you think about it, if those are the four major functions of punishment, one question that you should be able to answer by the time I get done with this presentation and the next presentation is, which one of the functions are we really doing well? And the answer there is really the only one that we are doing well is retribution. For the most part, social protection has not necessarily, we still have violent crime, and we violence was actually on the downward trend even before we ramped up a lot of our mass incarceration. We went through a period of mass incarceration, and then it's kind of stabilized in a lot of places, but it's not completely gone away. So are we safer? There is not spotty evidence for that. Rehabilitation. We're going to talk about recidivism, which really makes the point that instead of people going into prison and coming out better people, they seem to go into prison and come out worse people, or at least more committed to a life of crime. And we'll talk about why. And then finally, deterrence. So there certainly has not been, especially for like drug related crimes and property crimes, by locking people up, we have not changed, in any real significant way other people's likelihood of engaging in those types of crimes. So besides just making us feel better that we are punishing people that do something wrong in our society, the retribution function, for people that are big on criminal justice reform, they make the argument, using data, that we aren't necessarily doing the rest of the functions very well. So, for the rest of the presentation, up until we get to the part where we talk about the reasons behind mass incarceration. But for the rest of this presentation and the start of next presentation, we're going to consider the role of data in helping us answer some questions about, kind of the people whose lives are impacted by the criminal justice system, as well as bringing in some of the arguments, that, in particular, the conflict theorists have made about the role of, bias, and inequalities in the system. So, the first question: who is incarcerated and why? So, what you're looking at here is a pictorial that kind of displays, lifetime likelihood of imprisonment based on gender and race. So, just considering gender, if you're a man, 1 out of 9 lifetime likelihood, 1 out of 9 men will be imprisoned. If you're a woman, 1 out of 56 women will be imprisoned at some point in their likelihood, in their lifetime. For white men, it increases from 1 out of 9 to 1 out of 17, and for white women, it pretty much doubles to 1 out of 111. For black men, the 1 out of 9 is 1 out of 13, where it says 1 out of 13, but really that's 1 out of 3. And for black women, it's 1 out of 18. 1 out of 18. And then finally, for Latino men, it's 1 out of 6, and it is and it's worth noting that some of that has some things to do with immigration laws, and being arrested in regards to those types of infractions. And for Latino women, it's 1 out of 45. So just looking at this, obviously there are both gender and racial differences in your likelihood of being imprisoned. Your book gives you a series of charts where they compare the prison population with the larger U.S. population. And I include these charts as a way to encourage you to understand how to read these particular charts. So what we're doing here is we are looking at the percentage of the US population that has these characteristics, and then we look at the percentage of the prison population that has these characteristics. If the percentage in prison is much greater than the percentage in the general population, we say that that particular group is overrepresented in prison. If we say that it is underrepresented, if it's much lower or lower than their general population. So first, just in terms of age, and this was one of those biases that I mentioned in regards to arrest. We know that one group in particular is less likely to receive to be arrested, especially for lower level infractions, and that's the senior citizens. And it probably has a lot to do with stereotypes about the elderly being frail and weak and not being a danger. But as you can see, when the 55 and older population is 35.8% of the prison population, they are of the general population, but they're only 10.6% of the prison population. And although we might also can make arguments that maybe the elderly are just less likely to engage in criminal acts, and that is true, we also do know that this has something to do with the diminished likelihood they have of facing arrest when they do engage in lower level criminal acts. Then, in terms of race and ethnicity, as you can see, African Americans and Latinos are both overrepresented in prison, in the sense that their prison population is much higher than their general population, while whites are underrepresented. And so this is important because if you just looked at the percentages, you might would say, well, if 35% of the prison population is black and 33% is white, that really isn't that much of a difference. Well, no, not if you only look at that particular set of numbers. Those numbers don't mean much until you compare that with the fact that 64% of the population is white, while only 12% of the population is black, which means that for African Americans, they are almost triple their rate in prison as they are in the general population, while for whites, they are almost half of their rate in the prison population as they are in the general population. And then finally, in terms of gender, as you can see, of course, men and women are almost equally split in the general population, but men are overwhelmingly represented in prison. And part of that has to do, once again, with kind of stereotypes about who's more dangerous as well as who's more violent, and who's more sympathetic to juries versus who's less sympathetic. And so women are just a very small percentage of the overall prison population, despite being, over half of the general population. And so you have, in addition, specifically about gender, this just gives you an idea of the types of crimes that, when women are arrested, what percentage of this specific crime was committed by women. And it's just interesting, and just kind of see the change, that for the most part, even though there is still this gender disparity in arrest and incarcerations, that this has increased. So either women have become increasingly more criminal, or police have become better at crimes committed by women have become more likely to be reported, and police have become more likely to arrest them. So you could do some research and offer some differing interpretations of that. And then the final kind of slide just makes the point that, once again, in terms of education, the lower level of your education, the more likely you are to be in prison, except, of course, because so many people nowadays do graduate from high school. High school graduate is kind of the leading percentage in terms of prisoners. But it's worth noting that college graduates, very few are part of the prison population, less than 5%, although they are 30.9, almost 31% of the United States population. And so, just once again, that kind of just helps. Well, it makes a couple of points. First of all, that maybe people that go to college are less likely to commit crimes, especially crimes related to poverty or being impoverished. But the conflict theorist in sociology would also say that it also has something to do with the fact that if you have the money to hire an attorney to fight the system, that for lower level of infractions, you are just less likely to be imprisoned. And conflict theorists would encourage you to really ask yourself why that is. And so we will be coming back to those whys, and how conflict theorists approach this subject in the next presentation.